All right, so now that we have gone through we've hit that barrier of entry, we've gone into the murky territory of repurposed technical terms, we're now going to talk about the car model. Now, it won't look like we're talking about the car model until the very last slide where you'll see where I'm headed, right? Like the car model will be landing the plane. That said, this is session 6 is the most important. These two sessions, 5 and 6, are the most important component from graduating from an understanding of the dichotomies into understanding the cognitive functions and which cognitive functions are preferred in which personality type. All right, so this is, again, brain, spongy and bruised, totally understand. That's okay, keep going, because we're getting to the most important component right now. All right, this is the barrier of entry. If we can get through this, we can do anything, coach. Send me in, I'm ready, right? That's where we'll be. Okay, so we won't be talking about the car model until the very last slide, and that's okay because it'll all be sort of leading up to it, and that will be landing the plane. All right, so let's talk about the perceiving and the judging processes again. What is a perceiving process? A perceiving process brainstorms, makes connections, learns without judgment, has aha moments, and remembers things. All right, that's what a perceiving process does. That's not an exhaustive list, right? Okay, that's a truncated list, but fundamentally that's what the perceiving processes do. And that's the S or the N in your 4-letter code. Now, I haven't talked about this before, but we'll address it right now. Why is intuition indicated by an N instead of an I? Well, it's because the letter I was already taken up with the word introvert. So if you had two I's, right, if you're an introvert and an intuitive, it would be IITJ or IIFJ, and that would be difficult to manage. So instead, the intuitive word is referenced with an N for the second letter in an intuition. Sometimes you'll see online or in technical manuals or writings, you'll see a little I, a big N, and then a little T, right, in intuition. That's how some people write it, to indicate the N is referring to intuition. But if you remember that N means intuition, you're on the right path. So your perceiving process is either sensory or intuitive. And what those do is they learn, they brainstorm, they make connections, they learn without judgment, they have aha moments, and they remember. The judging processes, right, thinking and feeling processes, they evaluate, they determine right action, they value good versus bad, they prioritize and organize, and they think in should statements. So remember when we just talked about how perceiving processes learn without judgment? There's no judgment there, right? They're just taking in information and they're going, okay, this is interesting. Huh, that's fascinating. Oh, that's totally countercultural. How about that? The judging processes, they do think in terms of vetting. They think in should statements. This should be the case. This is what should happen. And for a judging process, it needs to do that because it has to predict a should. It has to put out into the world a should concept. What decision do I make? Well, I should do this, right? Because this should happen. So judging processes, the thinking and feeling processes, totally thinks in shoulds. The perceiving processes, sensing and intuition, don't think in shoulds at all. They're totally non-prejudicial. All right, so perceiving and judging processes. So we're going to talk about the sandwich. Here's the 4-letter dichotomy sandwich. Here's how you know what the cognitive function set is for any type. You take the 4-letter code. Now, we call it the 4-letter code because the dichotomies, well, a lot of people use that as their complete information, and that's all they need to know in order to, to have it be useful. It really was initially just a code. It was like a secret decoder ring. This was meant to be a reference to your cognitive functions. So instead of saying, I use this cognitive function and this cognitive function, I could just quickly say I'm an ENTP. So each of the 16 personality types, each of the 16 Myers-Briggs personality types is a code to reference which mental processes that personality type is using. If you notice in the sandwich, and I'm calling it a sandwich because on the outside is the extrovert and the judger piece for an ESTJ. It could be introvert, it could be perceiver, it doesn't matter. In your 4-letter code, the two outside letters are, think of them as bread, okay? Think of them as what's holding the sandwich together. The two letters inside are where we're going to find our cognitive functions. We're going to find a perceiving process, which is either S or N, and we're going to find a judging process, which is either T or F, okay? And the cognitive functions are in the middle of the sandwich. The two outside letters, bread. The two inside letters, the meat, okay? The last letter will refer to your organization style. All right, so that's judger or perceiver. Remember, we talked about how they're organization oriented, either inner world organization or outer world, but we know what our organization style is based on the last letter. So that piece of bread, that's an important piece of bread. That's going to be a diagnostic tool to let us know which functions we're using. And remember, with the organization style, judgers organize externally, whereas perceivers organize internally. So in order to connote which style of organization we prefer, we know that if we're a judger, if we're a J, we are going to externalize or extrovert our judging process. What is the judging process? Thinking and feeling, right? Let's go back up to refer to that. Judging processes, thinking, feeling, all right? So when we get back to this, if you're a judger, your thinking and feeling process, whichever one it is, right, because you'll be a thinker or a feeler, will always be extroverted. Always, always, always. If you're a judger, your thinking and feeling process will always be extroverted, all right? So that's connoted or connotated or whatever you want to say with a little E next to it. If you're a perceiver, all right, you organize internally, inside of yourself in an introverted fashion. So your T or F, whichever one you are, will always have an I by it. That's the attitude, right? The little E, the little I, those are referring to the attitude and the direction in which it goes. J's, T, F will always be have an extroverted attitude. It will always go outward. Perceivers will always have an introverted attitude with their T and F. All right. Everybody on board so far? Making sense? I probably am checking in too often, but again, this is the barrier of entry. This is why a lot of people run in the other direction. Okay, good, good, okay. So your organizational style will also let you know how you prefer your sensing and intuitive process, because your organization style tells you where you like your freedom. So for a judger, they always want their freedom internal, introverted, inwardly focused. Now your sensing and intuitive preference, that's how you learn. That's why it's your freedom. You're doing it openly, you're learning openly, it's non-prejudicial, you are not making any decisions, you are just taking in and understanding, learning new information. So that is where you like your freedom, is whatever your sensing or intuitive process is. If you're a judger, that will always be internal. It will always be introverted or inwardly focused. So your sensing or intuitive process will always have a little I next to it. If you're a perceiver, it goes the opposite direction. You want your freedom to be external. That means your sensing and intuitive process will always have a little E next to it, indicating extroversion or external freedom, okay? So judgers will always have a little I next to the sensing or intuitive preference, and perceivers will always have a little E next to their sensing and intuitive preference. I'm going to go back to the previous slide. Just to remind everybody, if you're a judger, you organize externally, all right? So thinking and feeling will always be pointed outward. And if you're a judger, your freedom is internal. So the S and the N will always have a little I next to it. It will always be internal. And if you're a perceiver, your thinking and feeling or judging process will always be introverted. Okay, that's where you want to organize. You are organizing internally. And if you are a perceiver, your sensing and intuitive process will always be extroverted or pointing outward. Now, does that make sense? All right, I just want to check in. Just want to make sure that everybody's getting that piece. Now, we had a hiccup there for just 1 second. I just want to make sure that everybody understands this piece because it's very important. Yes. Okay. All right, cool. Makes sense. Should the P be green? No, because it's still your organization. Let's just ignore that one in case it's supposed to be. Actually, I think I'm making an executive decision on that. Should I make the P green? And should I make the box around the letter P, should I make that green? And I decided no with the organization style. All right, cool. All right, so let's take ESTJ. Remember we had that sandwich. All right, the letters on the end are the bread. The letters in between are the meat. The sensing, so the sensing and the thinking portions, that's where we're going to get our cognitive function set, right? That's where we're going to understand how which cognitive functions they use. And we're going to use the outer letters, the bread, to direct us into understanding which cognitive functions this particular type utilizes. All right, so we know that they're an extrovert, all right? And so their favorite process is going to be extroverted. We know that because they're an extrovert. We know they're a judger, so we understand how their mind organizes information. If they're a judger, that means that we know that they extrovert their judging process and they introvert their sensing process, right? Because it's always the opposite. Now, I'll just give you a little hint here. I didn't mention this before, but I'll give you a little hint. The reason why judgers are called judgers is because they extrovert their judging process, and that's what the world sees of them. If you extrovert something, that means you're putting it out into the outside world, and so the rest of the world can see that about you. So because they're extroverting their thinking process, the world calls them a judger. Make sense? Right? The world goes, oh, you're a judger because that's what I see of you. That's what I'm manifesting. So the opposite is with the perceiver. What does a perceiver do? They extrovert their perceiving process. So the world goes, oh, you must be a perceiver because that's what I'm seeing of you. That's what you're putting out into the world. So that's just another little way to think about it. All right, so what is this person's favorite mental process? We know that they're an extrovert. We know that they're a judger. We know that because they're a judger, they're using extroverted thinking and introverted sensing. So which one of these is the extroverted process, right? Because that's what they prefer. They prefer extroversion. That means that extroverted thinking, or TE, extroverted thinking, is their favorite process. It is what is called the dominant cognitive function in technical terms. Dominant cognitive function. And that means their auxiliary cognitive function, all right, TE, extroverted thinking, what we call effectiveness, that means their auxiliary process is introverted sensing or memory, okay? So their dominant process is extroverted thinking, their auxiliary process is introverted sensing, all right? Make sense? That's how we figured it out. We use the bread at the end to figure out the meat in the middle, all right? We know they're an extrovert, so that means that they're going to love their extroverted process. Which one is their extroverted process? The thinking process, because they're a judger. All judgers extrovert their thinking or feeling process, so we know that extroverted thinking is their favorite. And that means introverted sensing is going to be their auxiliary or secondary process. Auxiliary cognitive function, or co-pilot, introverted sensing. Now, when we say co-pilots, we also call, in the Genius style, we call the dominant process, we call it the driver. We think that in the car model is a really powerful tool for figuring out how these cognitive functions work inside of you. So the extroverted thinking process is going to be the driver. It's technically called the dominant, okay, or primary, but we call it the driver. And that means the auxiliary, secondary process is the co-pilot. In the car model, you think of the driver process as the one in charge, the one who technically has control over the wheel. It doesn't matter what anybody else says. They are the ones who ultimately end up calling the shots, and your dominant process is like that within you. Okay? All right. So let's use me as an example. We just used ESTJs. Let's use me as an example. Well, what am I? I'm an E. I'm an extrovert. That means I like my outer world over my inner world. I'm an intuitive. That means that I prefer speculation and advanced pattern recognition. That's my preference. I'm a T. I'm a thinker. And that means that I make my evaluation criteria using metrics, impersonal criteria, right? Thinking is impersonal criteria. And the P refers to perceiver, which means that I organize my inner world and I want outer world freedom. All right, so that's my sandwich. ENTP is my sandwich. I'm a perceiver, which means I extrovert or externalize my understanding or perceiving process. In this case, it's intuition. So a little E goes next to my N. And I introvert, because I'm a perceiver, I introvert or internalize my decision-making process or my judging process. And so then in this case, it's thinking. All right, so I'm NETI. Because I'm an extrovert, that means I favor an extroverted process. In this case, intuition, making extroverted intuition the driver process. So that's my driver. And that means by default, my introverted process becomes my supportive process or the co-pilot. So NE driver, TI co-pilot. Extroverted intuition. Now, what do we call extroverted intuition? What was the alternate name for it? Exploration. That's my driver. It could also be called NE, right? So there's really 3 different names that we'll be referring to these cognitive functions with. NE is the shorthand. Extroverted intuition is the technical name. Exploration is the nickname. Okay, NE, extroverted intuition, exploration. That's my driver. And that makes my co-pilot TI, or introverted thinking, or what we also call accuracy. All right, everybody getting this? This is all making sense? All right, just want to check in one more time. Got it? Okay, cool. All right, you're probably doing this with your own type. I recommend you do it right now. If you have a piece of paper and pencil, make your own little sandwich, figure out what the cognitive function set is for you right now. That makes it a lot easier to figure out. Okay, so in the driver model, how do we know what the driver is? How do we know what the co-pilot is, the 10-year-old and the 3-year-old? Well, we figured out the driver and the co-pilot. Okay, we already figured it out in my type. We figured out that extroverted intuition, NE, or exploration is my driver. We figured out that the co-pilot is introverted thinking, also shorthand TI, or accuracy. That's my driver and co-pilot. But how do I know what my 10-year-old and my 3-year-old are? How do I know what the other passengers in the car are? All right, this is when you don't look at it in terms of a car model, they call it your cognitive function stack. Okay, this is your stack. So think of it, at the top would be extroverted intuition, and then introverted thinking, and then the 3rd, and then the 4th. Now, in technical terms, the 10-year-old in the car model is called your tertiary. So it would be your dominant, your auxiliary, your tertiary, and then the final one, the 4th one, is called your inferior. That's their technical names. Dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior. We feel like the car model makes that super simple, so we call it the driver, the co-pilot, the 10-year-old, and the 3-year-old. And the reason why we have 10-year-old and 3-year-old is because we feel that that's approximately the age that most of them mature to. So your tertiary or your 10-year-old process is going to be a mirror opposite, or have a mirror opposite relationship with your co-pilot. The reason for this is what we call the cost of specialization. Each of these cognitive functions has a function that is its sort of yin-yang, right? Like it provides the opposite, equal to and opposite process, meaning that if everybody only used introverted thinking, then the world would be sorely missing its opposite process, or the process that makes up for its blind spots. So in our personality type, our driver or dominant, our co-pilot or auxiliary processes are our strengths, and that means that the tertiary and inferior, or what's called the 10-year-old or 3-year-old, those are things that are not strengths. Those are more like weaknesses in us. Now, they don't have to be exclusively weaknesses, and we'll talk a lot about what that looks like when they're not weaknesses. However, or when they're not just messing you up. But that said, the 10-year-old and the 3-year-old are going to be the reverse or mirror opposite of the driver and co-pilot. Well, if my co-pilot is technically introverted thinking, then that makes my 10-year-old extroverted feeling. It's extroverted feeling. The shorthand for that is FE, and the nickname is harmony. So my 10-year-old is the harmony process, or extroverted feeling. And the same thing plays out with the driver and the 3-year-old. If my driver is extroverted intuition, make a guess as to what my 3-year-old is. Opposite of extroverted, introverted. Opposite of intuition, sensing. Introverted sensing is my 3-year-old. SI is its shorthand, and memory is its nickname. And that's how you figure out the cognitive function stack for any type, okay, for any type. Is this making sense to everybody? Do you have it? Do you want me to walk through any of those slides again, which I can certainly do? Everybody got it? Yes? Okay, cool. Got it. All right. So your job, your exercise, if you choose to go for the profiler training certification, your exercise is to figure out the cognitive functions for all 16 types. All right, that's your job. Now, what we're going to do is in the members area, we're going to have a worksheet provided for you. So you'll see each of the types, and then you'll have 4 different, like it's on a spread, it basically looks like a spreadsheet. It's 4 different designations for cognitive functions. And then your job is to fill out that worksheet to figure out what the cognitive functions are for all 16 types. And then the key, all right, will be on the website as well, so you can self-grade and figure out how you did. And again, this is the barrier of entry for people. This is the most complicated piece. Now, walking through it, hopefully it wasn't that complicated. Hopefully you really kind of understood and were able to get it. This is the part that most people look at and go, you know, there be dragons and flee. So if you've got it, that's awesome. And again, would you like me to go through any other slide, any of the slides, like the one that does the breakdown, or do you think you're good? All good here. Okay, cool. Very cool. All right, so now you guys are smarter, wiser. You know way more. You know the dichotomies on a massive breakdown, and you guys know how to, or you now know how to break down each of the personality types and figure out what their cognitive functions are. Next in this module, this is the cognitive function model. Next in the module, what we're going to do in the next session is we're going to do a breakdown or overview of all 8 of the cognitive functions and effectively what they perform, and then we're going to go massively granular. We're going to go way down the rabbit's hole of every single one of the cognitive functions and really understand them on a truly deep level. So stay tuned. That's what we have coming up.